Today on Actual Intelligence, we have a very important and timely discussion with Dr. Robert Niebuhr of ASU, whose recent opinion piece in Inside Higher Education is titled AI in Higher Ed, an Impending Collapse. Robert is a teaching professor and honors faculty fellow at the Barrett Honors College at ASU. And the reason that I invited him to speak with us today on Actual Intelligence is his perspective on artificial intelligence in education and his contention, roughly, that higher ed's rush to embrace artificial intelligence is going to lead us to some rather troubling places. So let's get to it with Dr. Robert Niebuhr. Rob, we talked a little bit about this on our pre-call, and I don't usually start a podcast like this, but what you said to me was so striking, so nauseating, so infuriating that I think it's a good place to begin. And maybe some of our listeners who value actual intelligence will also find it as appalling as I do, or at least a point of interest that needs to be talked about. You were in a meeting, and we're not going to talk about exactly necessarily what that meeting was, but you're in a meeting with a number of other faculty members, and something interesting arose. And I will allow you to share that experience with us, and we'll use that as a springboard for this discussion.
Sure. No, so obviously, as you can imagine, right? I mean, faculty are trying to cope with a perceived notion that students are using AI to create essays, and in the where I'm at, one of the backbones in my unit to assess work is looking at argumentative essays. So the sort of the idea that this argumentative essay is the backbone of a grade, an assessment, and if we're suspecting that they're using AI, faculty said, well, why should we bother grading essays if they're written by bots? And there's a lot to unpack there, and a lot of things that are problematic. But yeah, the idea that we don't have to combat combat the perceived threat of student misuse of AI, we just will forego critical assessment. That was, not a lone voice in the room. That seemed to be something that was reasonably popular.
Was there any recognition of what might be being sacrificed by not ever having students write another essay just to avoid them using AI, which, of course, we don't want them to just have essays write. Of course, we don't want them to just have AI write their essays. That's not getting us anywhere. But was there any conception that there might be some loss in terms of that policy?
I mean, I think so. I mean, I imagine, I think my colleagues come from a place where they're trying to figure out and cope with a changing reality, right? But there is also a subtext across faculties in the United States of being overworked, and especially with the mantra among administration of AI will help us ramp up or scale up our class sizes, and we can do more, and we can all this sort of extra stuff that it would seem like faculty would be more of their time and more of their effort as an task here. That I think that may have been part of it. I don't know that the idea of like the logical implication of this, that, if we no longer exercise students' brains, if we no longer have them go through a process that encourages critical thinking and articulating that through writing, like what that means, I don't know that they sort of thought it beyond like, well, this could we could try it and see, was kind of the mentality that I sort of gauged from the room. But it's a bigger problem, right? I think the larger aspect of, what do we do? What can we do as faculty in this sort of broad push for AI all over the place? And then the idea of the mixed messages students get, right? Students get this idea, well, this is the future. If you don't learn how to use it, if you don't, understand it, you're going to be left behind. And then at the same time, it's like, well, don't use it for my class, right? Learn it, but don't use it here. And that's super unclear for students, and it's unclear for faculty too, right? So it's one of those things that it's not. I don't think in the short term it works, and as you implied, right, the long term solution here of getting rid of essay assignments in a discussion-based seminar that relies on essays as a critical. I mean, this is not a viable solution, right? We got the entire purpose of the program in this case.
And yet a lot of faculty, from what you described, and a lot of what I've read as well, is also moving towards having AI be able to grade the students' work, not just on simple tests, but on essays. And as you point out in your article, that's potentially moving us to a place where kids are using AI to write the essays, and then faculty are using AI to grade the essays. And when did the human being get involved in between in terms of any intellectual growth?
Yeah. No, I think it's a really big problem because, again, those long-term implications, are clear as you laid out, but, it's also, I mean, like this notion that there's a tool that obviously can help us, multiple avenues where AI can be something that's helps us be more efficient and all this other stuff. That's true. So it's there. So we should gauge and understand it. But it doesn't mean you just use it everywhere. You can buy, I don't know, you can buy alcohol at the grocery store. It doesn't mean you have it with your Cheerios, right? I mean, there's a time and place. Polite society says, you can consume this at these times with these meals or in this company, right? It's not all of this sort of thing. So, the message that I think at the level of respect, right? If we don't respect the students, if we don't lay out clear guidelines and we don't show them respect, we don't ask for respect back if we use bots to grade, then the whole thing just becomes a charade. And I think the system begins to break down. I think people wind up losing the point of what the exercise is all about anyway. And I made not just the assignment or the class, but like higher education, right? I mean, the point is to teach us how to be better thinkers, to gauge, evaluate information, use evidence, apply it in our lives as we see fit. And if we're not prepped for that, then what did they prep us for? If the student's perspective, it's like, well, what did I just do? What did I pay for? That's a huge long term.
It seems like that what did I pay for question is going to come to bear heavily on higher education in the near future, because if students are able to use AI to accomplish some of their work, and if faculty are using AI to grade some of their work and so on, and then these degrees are costing hundreds of thousands of dollars, and it's an effectual piece of paper that maybe that loses value in essence also because the students didn't really get anything from that process or get as much as they used to because they're using AI. Is this moving towards some kind of gross reassessment of the value of higher education or its role in our society entirely?
I mean, I think it certainly has the potential, right? I mean, I would even look back and think of a steady decline, right? That this is one of many pieces that have gone that. And I mean, mentioning in your question just there, right? That the sense of, students as client or customer, how that has changed the sort of the interface and how, we think of this whole endeavor, right? I mean, and and this leads to things like retention numbers and all these sort of things, that mental gymnastics that happens to do all these things. And the truth be told, right? Different paths for different people, right? There's not a single, like, you don't have to get the degree in physics to be a successful. But the student as customer, I think, also has solidified this notion that we can listen to student feedback, right? And student feedback is important, so I'll qualify that. That standards were lower. I know from my own example, even 20 years ago, right, that undergraduates would have to produce a capstone thesis as part of their bachelor's degree. I know firsthand from the time that, the history department had looked at exit surveys of people who didn't finish their history degree. And I said, well, why didn't you finish your history? Oh, well, whatever the program was, psychology, sociology, doesn't matter, whatever the other degree was, that degree program didn't require a thesis. So that was easier, right? That was the student saying, you know what, I'm going to opt out of the hard work. And I'm going to take this other. And so the history department's answer, kind of like the we'll stop grading essays, was we won't require a thesis. And that'll stem the tide of our losses. Of course it didn't, right? Because there are larger things going on. And some of it's internal, some of it's external and out of history department's control. But I think part of this also then sort of, cuts this notion of the rhetoric in the last at least 2 decades of college is your ticket to a successful career. And it's just quantifiable, right? I mean, there's no doubt that, if you have a college degree, your lifetime earnings will be such and such amount higher than, right? There's clear evidence there. There's tangible things. But that's become degraded, I think, to a simple binary, like, oh, my piece of paper gets me this. And I think that mentality has been sort of seeping in. And I think this is kind of where some of these things are coming from. Like, it is just a piece of paper. I don't have to worry about, what skill set I get in higher ed because I'm going to learn on the job anyway. Or I don't, like students who say, I don't see this as valuable to what I'm going to do. So it's fast to say the reckoning long term, like upending higher ed. I mean, I think as some of these questions linger and simmer and costs get higher and, parents get more upset and students with their loans, I mean, I can't see it going in perpetuity in the direction that it's going, with or without AI. I think AI maybe speeds this up.
In a sense, I see this as an extension of Goodhart's law, which is that if we just focus on the measurement, then the thing that we're measuring becomes invaluable or valueless to us because the measurement becomes the value. And I see that happening with AI, right? The goal is to create a paper that gets an A. It doesn't matter if I use AI to do it because I've achieved the goal, right? The outcome that I want. I've satisfied Goodhart's law. I've produced the outcome and the measurement has been achieved. I haven't learned to write a paper or think for myself or put a sentence together, but I've nevertheless achieved the outcome. And that seems true from both perspectives. There's the student perspective, which is that I've produced the paper. I've gone through a series of steps that have made the paper happen. I didn't write it, but I used AI to do it in a worst case scenario and presented it. And then it happens from the teacher's perspective, which is that whether or not AI grades it, they have in fact nevertheless produced the artifact that I need to assess and achieve the assessment. And everybody's happy, except, that this is utterly undermining the fundamental premise of education itself, which is the development of the individual. Do you think down the road, and I know this is purely speculative and maybe it's overly hopeful, in fact, but does the reckoning in higher education and maybe even in secondary education and primary education come down to saying, look, AI is something that students are going to be able to use and be proficient in regardless of whether or not we exist. The only way that we're going to carve out a meaningful existence for ourselves is essentially almost a reversion to what higher education was years ago. Maybe it is not as much for everybody. Maybe it is more for those people who really want to become intellectuals, use their minds, develop the mindsets and the skills of the intellectual in the positive sense of that, in whatever way they're contributing to society. Maybe there are fewer institutions, but they are holding the line further on the cultivation of the individual. And those individuals, maybe because there are fewer of them and because they are more specialized in certain critical thinking skills, become again more valuable to society. Is that possible, do you think, or am I pipe dreaming here? Because I just hope education doesn't implode entirely, though I think a reckoning is going to be healthy.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Yeah, no, I mean, the first bit that crossed my mind as you were talking was this sort of this saying, something about, some of us can pretend all the time and get away with it. All of us can pretend some of the time, but we all can't pretend all the time, right? Like this sort of sense of like there has to be, someone has to tell the truth, right? Like the emperor with no clothes. It's like, well, clearly there's something wrong. But to the future and where this sort of looks and where you went towards the end of the question. Um, I mean, I don't know, but if the rhetoric about AI reshaping the workforce, if part of that comes true, and if it's about, you know, one skilled, let's call him a critical thinker, because ideally that's what's going on, but one skilled critical thinker at a desk can enter in the correct keystrokes to enable a machine to do the work of what 10 people would have done. I don't know, right? Let's assume the sort of productivity is there across white collar um, professions. I think if you give everyone a college degree and the possibility for a meaningful job is so slim, you create a society that is seething with despair and resentment, right? I'm a scholar of primarily the Cold War, and you look at across Eastern Europe, the correlation between high unemployment yet high levels of degrees of bachelor's degrees and sort of resentment and the search, right? Like there, especially in the 1970s and 80s, there's this sort of lost, there's a sense of hopelessness. Like I can't survive here in Poland or Yugoslavia or Bulgaria or whatever it was. And if I don't fit, then that's like the society has failed me. And if we have this scenario where everyone just gets pushed through and gets a degree, but they're doing something that they haven't been trained in, or they don't enjoy, or it doesn't fit with anything, it doesn't realize their personal goals. The system has to collapse. We have to reshape it into something that's trade school, uh, or various levels, right? And like the idea of maybe a liberal arts, uh, uh, system that, people who want to enter in and be this sort of intellectual, the philosopher kings, I suppose, right? But there probably should be some sort of system that would recognize that, because it doesn't seem like society, we playing too many games and playing with fire if society is just sort of running on the status quo.
I want to bounce your article in Inside Higher Ed against another one that was fairly contemporaneous, and I'll put it in the show notes. And the title was effectively AI is Changing Higher Education. And it was very neutral in its assessment. But within that was a survey that was conducted of thousands of college students, 2/3 of whom reported that the use of AI was probably degrading their critical thinking skills. And the author billed this as neutrally changing higher education. And I think there's a prevailing attitude among many faculty members, at least the literature that's coming out is so much rah-rah about artificial intelligence that, if anything, that neutrality of the author was conservative relative to, I think, a lot of how educators are viewing it. But I was very disturbed by that characterization. If 2/3 of students report that using AI is probably degrading their critical thinking skills, how the hell are we describing that as neutrally changing or having positive and negative effects? It seems to me that has, at least for the time being, should raise enough alarms for us to say, wait a second, that's not having a neutral effect at all. That's a terrible degradation of higher education, especially given that it wasn't really cultivating critical thinking skills to begin with. And now that students themselves are reporting that it's harming it, especially when students tend to overestimate their critical thinking skills in most research surveys about it, this seems like it's a pretty clear indictment of artificial intelligence's role so far in education.
Yeah, no, I think, and this sort of, I'm not surprised that as you said, like this, I think seeing that as neutral or um, continuing to just cheerlead a notion among administration and faculty that this is the new direction, no matter what, right? Those people who think they're critical thinking, those students must be misguided somehow. They don't understand, right? I mean, you have this sort of disconnected mentality. But that does it. It creates a serious issue for the whole system, because then again, it's how willing are those how willing are those 2/3 who responded that way? How willing are they to follow the rules? How willing are they to not say, well, this is all kind of a sham. So I'll bend a little bit. I'll sort of have more AI do more of my work. Like, who's going to catch me mentality? And that's not to say they're bad people for doing that. That's kind of a natural reaction. We've encouraged people to take this sort of approach. And because students, increasingly, anecdotally, I've witnessed the decline in punishing students for academic offenses, right? I mean, I remember 20 years ago, as a grad TA, I caught two students that I was pretty sure that they copied each other, and they had essays that they changed some words, but I was convinced, and the dean's office concurred. This does seem that way, but you understand the one student has a serious problem right now. His mother's very ill, and we can give him a break. And I'm not out to, obviously, circumstances are circumstances. Those are real, right? I mean, I'm not some sort of, we have to always, but you have a heart. But, what is that? What message does that send? That it's, oh, but if I have a sad story or something's going on in my life, it's okay. And I think this AI use and that in the lack of clarity, and this sort of all this sort of push is simply encouraging the kind of behavior that we overall don't want. So maybe it's neutral now. Let's say give it's got the benefit of the doubt. Maybe it's neutral today. I don't think it's neutral in a year from now or 6 months. Right? I don't think that can be. It's a sustainable thing.
Let me touch on that because I was around. I'm old enough to have been around when the internet hit higher education. And I remember at that time, two things that fascinated me that I thought were very odd and the faculty were, as they are now with AI, I think, racing to embrace the internet, Google searches, HTML, and, so forth. And one of the things that struck me as very odd was the push they felt to incorporate the internet into their classes and teach students how to use it and so forth, which I didn't understand because it was very clear that the students were far more adept at it than any of the faculty were, and they were becoming the digital natives that they are now. And so I don't know why anyone felt as though we were needing to teach them how to use the internet when they were far ahead of us, obviously, in all of that. And the second thing that emerged at the same time was an argument that it was a lateral shift, that reading short little web pages and clicking on different links, and as things got shorter and shorter, and web pages got more desperate and so forth, it was just a neutral shift in how people thought, and it was not a degradation of the ability to focus long-term, to go deeper, and so on. And I said, well, how can it not be? If we look at the two formats, you have a book on one hand that is a contiguous set of ideas developed more deeply, and then you have a number of different web pages that are skirting across many different HTML links to different short paragraphs about things. And I sort of tried to scream at the wind a little bit about it back then, but it was obvious that it was blowing in the wrong direction. And it seems to me AI is that only times about 1,000 in terms of what's happening. Once again, we see a clamor to teach students how to use AI and incorporate it into their lives when they are already far ahead of us in terms of what AI is doing and how to use it. And the second thing is this notion that, again, it's lateral, if not beneficial, when the evidence suggests otherwise. Can you, in your insight, where you've given your position, I'm wondering if you can help me appreciate what is behind the faculty rush in education to embrace this? Is it, I get a sense, and then I'll be quiet because I'm trying to ask you a question. I've only asked 4 so far, but I get a sense that in a sense, I think the faculty kind of feel helpless. That there's a sense that if we can't beat this, and we have no idea how we could possibly beat this, then we might as well just go with it. Do you feel like that's accurate?
Yes. Maybe a little more to nuance to the yes. I suppose on the one side, again, faculty generally coming from a good place, right? I want to help my students, and I think that's rather ubiquitous among I want to help students do better and succeed. And I think if there's this huge push to say that AI is the future, AI is, if we don't talk about it, if we don't introduce it to students, if we don't sort of teach them things about it, that we're doing the students a disservice. So I think there's this reflective, like, we don't have much time, we have to teach them something, let's chisel together, some sort of idea, and then I can feel good about having passed on some sort of, knowledge to my students and help me be better prepared. I think that's perhaps part of it. But yeah, I think it helplessness in terms too of, I feedback or things I hear from faculty in my unit and elsewhere is this sort of helplessness that administration has a tremendous amount of power and is sort of pushing an agenda that faculty don't have the ability to push back against as well, right? So, like, again, a perfect world, let's think about this. Let's figure out what's actually necessary, how we can prepare students. Let's think about this and be reasonable about it versus the sort of top-down push. And I think faculties across the country have lost an ability to be self-governing as they would have been, 20 years ago. This and the sort of administrative superstructure that's dominated, universities recent years. Just simply says this is what we do, and part of this is, I think, like before, right? So my university is, I think, the biggest in the country, or certainly one of the top 3 or something like this. And the notion of scaling up is kind of always on sort of the talking points of this, right? Let's scale up, let's do something else to have an even bigger, or let's grow by this much. Or that pressure then doesn't come with, let's hire X number of faculty to take care of, right? Let's hire this many more people to get. So it's asking more, but without giving more support. But I think too, what you mentioned in the beginning of the question with sort of the way the internet was, I haven't thought this through. This is just sort of, just on the spot here. Maybe this is not necessarily the best analysis, but my own sort of thought there is, we no longer have a robust research librarian network at universities, in my opinion. So in other words, like, folks who would have been in charge of perusing, the publications and journals and being in touch with faculty, doing research that, hey, I know you're a specialist in this. Here are the newest titles. Do you want me to buy this database, or whatever the thing might be, right? Like those, like, intermediaries between the material and then the faculty, those folks have been largely eliminated, and they're not being replaced as they retire. There's only a handful of programs that could do library science as a master's graduate degree anymore in this country. So with the idea that the internet just equalizes this, I'm just as equipped as you would be, or the research librarian would be, to just go online and find whatever I need. And that's also not necessarily true, right? I mean, I may be in touch with the things going on in my field, but there's so much going that I don't have time to in a sense of research, I am overburdened in a way, and letting me fend for myself. Maybe it works, maybe it doesn't, but we've hollowed out a level of specialists who would be that point of reference to go in and look at all of those things, sort of filter a bit and help in the process. I think that's something I think the internet may have helped do, and the way that so much became online in the last 20 years in terms of research materials, primary sources, all this sort of stuff, and the downfall, I would say, of that profession.
That seems to me indicative, that issue with librarians seems indicative to me of a larger issue. And it's one that you mentioned as well earlier of the value of AI to the administration in terms of further economizing instruction. So what risk do you see, or do you hear on the ground, the tremblings of AI replacing faculty members for certain tasks? I mean, we went from faculty members to adjuncts to teaching assistants doing most of the work. And I have to think, and there's already publication about it, of administration seeing AI as the next great cost saving measure.
100%. Yeah. No, I think that's exactly right. I mean, the notion that you have sort of like at the grocery store, you have 2 or 3 checkouts that are open that has a person there checking you out versus the one person lording over 15 self checkouts. I think that's certainly, especially thinking about economizing in scale and saving money. I mean, that has to be, I see it now with the way that, students that used to be 100 students, 150, 200 maybe in a class was really big. And you had a faculty member with 3 or 4 or 5 TAs or whatever the breakdown would be. I know people at my university have 600, 700 students in class. That's, I don't know. How do you lose? I mean, that's just incomprehensible to me in terms of the point of higher ed, right? I mean, like you're not fostering any connectivity. You're not, I mean, it may as well be a bot because you, the student, will never interact.
Right.
Maybe the faculties of Nobel laureate, you'll never interact with. There's very little. That's I think, a huge piece of where this will go. And I think faculty are vulnerable. They've been made more vulnerable over the last decades. And I don't see it boding well. My advice to the faculty that we began the podcast, right? This notion of let's stop grading. I said, well, I mean, we should think of ways that we remain relevant, right? I mean, if we propose that, well, we just won't grade essays, we won't assign essays, then for sure the administration can hire someone at lower pay to do what we're doing in the classroom. That's not a far stretch of anyone's imagining. So I don't want to be a part of the group nullifies myself by taking away the prime thing that I can give, right? But not to ramble, but part of this fear too is a student yesterday had sent me something that was really interesting. So we're at Cold War seminar, and he read a book by John Lewis Gaddis. And he read it, he had some notes, he understood a lot, really bright guy. And then he said, I put into AI, I forget which program, but he put into AI, create a podcast that talks about this book. Holy cow. I listened to 10 or 15 minutes of it. It was 2 people talking. It mimicked, it could have been real. Had I been in the car listening, I would have thought this was a book talk about Guinness's last book on the call. It was insane how good it sounded. And, that would be easy for, recreate, Dr. Niebuhr in a discussion seminar. So, they can get my image and they can get my voice, and who knows? I mean, that can't be that.
No, and you raised the point about chatting with bots, and I'll piggyback on what you're saying right now. I can understand if we're going to have an interaction with bots as a tutor, and potentially valuably so. I'm not against all uses of AI, where if we're learning, say, the layers of the Earth's crust, as a very simplistic example, but nevertheless, we can rely on the AI to be relatively accurate in coaching us about the layers of the Earth crust. But now there are also AIs who will interact with you as Hamlet. Well, you could pull out any 50 Shakespeare scholars and have them respond to prompts, and you'll get different responses, all of them thoughtful. But this bot, who is deciding, but based on what algorithms are we deciding its responses as Hamlet to prompts that are not within Hamlet? That now we're crossing quite the Rubicon in terms of where we're putting trust in bots to educate our students or coach our students in ways that I don't think are reliable. And it's not even if the bot gives what might be very thoughtful Hamlet responses and very reasonable ones, they are a selection of an interpretation of Hamlet based on certain people, I guess, that it's searching across the internet, as opposed to others. And now that's equally dangerous to me as far as I can conceive.
Yeah, I think, that I the same sort of idea of the sort of book summary, and I mean, I think it's so even just fact, as you said, like just scientific facts that we know that could be provable. If we wind up having queries to the AI and say, okay, what is this, and it gives us the right answer, we check it, we know it. But at a point, right? I mean, we have to say, okay, it's been right 52 times. I trust it now. And and if I stop and check, like, you know what, I verified this is good. And now down the road, it lies to me. Or again, this other, avatar, other sort of AI sort of driven personality, or this comes in, and now I don't realize that I'm taking the information at face value. And again, I lose that critical thinking. I lose that ability, but that's also reasonable, right? If I checked it so many times, what else can I do? I'm a busy person, right? We're all busy people. How can I keep referring back and verifying? And I think that's going to be a huge problem if we wind up at some point saying, yep, that's good. And then we're due down the road.
It reminds me of an old Steve Martin joke. He would say that he thought it would be a great practical joke to play on kids if you raise them to speak wrong when they get to school. So all their words are incorrect and they have no idea.
Yeah.
It sort of seems like the same problem, right? At a certain point, the AI might be telling us everything that's wrong. We have no idea that it's wrong. And we're living in that world where everything is distorted and we don't even know. That's a terrifying prospect. Thanks for bringing that up.
I try to bring.
So as we wrap this up, what didn't I ask you about? What's the thing that you think we also need to talk about here that I didn't shed enough light on for this conversation?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, I guess my own sense is that the conversation, any conversation about higher ed, needs to be grounded in the basic principle of the point, like the value that we get from it, the goals that it brings us. That if that's at the center, if the idea of, instilling, students with the tools to actually survive in a dynamic world, my degree today might totally change. The reality might totally change in 10 years, whatever. If I'm still equipped to respond to that change, that's been a successful education, right? And the point of the critical thought, the reflection, preparing for really for our context in the United States. I mean, I think it's also part of the whole experience experiment with democracy, right? Informed citizenship. I mean, this is all part of it. If it's just, if the narrative about higher ed is simply the paper mill or degree mill for a job to get some sort of, higher number of a wage, or if it's about, finishing, just checking boxes and hitting goals without being ever checked or questioned. I mean, that's um, that's not the point, right? I mean, how are we growing? How are we building ourselves? How are we preparing for uncertain futures? And the conversation, they should always be centered on that, uh, whether it's AI or whether it's all this other stuff. That would be the thing I would sort of stress, but we've talked about that already, but I think I try to think of that in terms of any of these um, deep conversations.
I want to ask you one last question that just came to mind. What if I'm sure we have a lot of parents listening. I'm curious as to what message you would send to them if they have either students, children in college, or children headed to college in the somewhat near future. What's the message for them at this point with respect to all of that? Because I don't exactly know what it is.
Yeah, I mean, I, it seems what I think is not going to be a popular, or not going to be, what folks, necessarily can even want to hear or could act on it. But I guess part of it is to ensure you're involved and understand, ask them, what's the syllabus? I mean, I'll digress for a second, right? I mean, this is one of those things that I've had a critique about for a while. So it might grumpy old man coming out, but I mean, like the sort of sense of like universities, let's build a really luxurious dorm facility. Let's build up the sports center. Let's have, when the TV crew comes for the game day, we'll have brand new flowers. The sort of superficial wowing that happens. And parents, the tours are a big part of this, right? I mean, the tours show all the goodies. And not to
Right.
say that that's a bad thing, right? I mean, dorms were substandard 30 years ago in large, right? I mean, there's an argument for why these things are good. But I think a lot of there's been a cleavage between what parents are told the experience is going to be and what they're actually sort of shown and informed. And then where students want independence, students want, they're on their own now, they're decision makers in large part. And there's a sort of disconnection there. And I think it's hard. It's a big ask, but if parents can remain, ask the tough questions, like how many books in a library? How many, full-time faculty? How many, go down the list of academic credentials. And then look at the syllabi, look at the assignments from your students, right? Or think about if they're already in there or if they're going, right? Think about that as something you would do. And keep people's feet to the fire, right? I mean, to use sort of a tired metaphor, but I mean, keep that as much as you can and try to push back, because if students are customers, parents are the ones paying for it ultimately. So they're detached. They're the true customer, I suppose. And if they start calling up the deans and saying things like, what's going on here? Maybe things will change. Maybe there'll be a response. But stay informed, I guess, as much as they possibly can.
Well, that seems sagely to me, Robert. Thanks so much for being on Actual Intelligence. I appreciate it. And as your thinking evolves on this, maybe we can have you back in the future sometime and continue the discussion.
Sounds great. Thank you.
Thank you.